You're being controlled, and you don't even see it. It doesn't look like control. There are no commands, no force, no obvious chains. Just small moments. A doubt planted here. A guilt that doesn't belong to you. A quiet shift where your thoughts begin to feel unfamiliar. And slowly, something changes. Machiavelli wrote about power, not as something taken by strength, but something shaped quietly. Through the mind, you start questioning yourself more than them. You explain your feelings, then apologize for having them. You lose clarity, but can't name when it began. This is the silent architecture of control. Not loud, not visible, but deeply precise. And once you begin to notice it, you start to see it everywhere.
At first, nothing feels wrong. There are no clear signs. No moment you can point to and say, "This is where it started." It begins quietly, a small comment that lingers longer than it should. And so it passes. But something stays behind. A question forms in the background of your mind. Not about them, but about yourself. Did you misunderstand? Were you too sensitive? Did you overreact? This is where the shift begins. Not in control, but in perception. Because control, at its most refined level, does not force behavior. It reshapes how reality is seen. The words are simple. The moments are ordinary. But the effect is cumulative. A pattern forms. You explain yourself more. You defend things you never questioned before. You begin to rehearse your thoughts before speaking to them. And slowly, your mind adjusts. Not all at once, but piece by piece. This is the part most people never notice. Because nothing dramatic happens. There is no clear conflict, no obvious harm. Only a quiet discomfort. A subtle imbalance, where one person remains certain, and the other begins to doubt. Over time, that doubt becomes familiar, almost normal. And this is where the control deepens. Because once a person starts questioning their own perception, they begin to rely on something else for clarity. Not their instincts, not their inner voice, but the one who planted the doubt in the first place. It doesn't feel like control. It feels like trying to understand. But underneath that effort, something is slowly being handed over. Not decisions, not actions, but something far more powerful. The ability to trust your own mind. And once that begins to fade, the rest becomes easier. Not through force, but through quiet, consistent influence. The kind that doesn't demand control. It simply becomes it. It doesn't begin with you. It begins long before, in places that are rarely seen. Because control, in its quietest form, is often learned, not created. There is a pattern beneath the surface, a need that was never met, and so it is managed, through others. For some, control becomes a way to feel safe, a way to create certainty in a world that once felt unpredictable, not through connection, but through influence. This is where the roots begin, not always in cruelty, but in adaptation. A child who learns that love is conditional may grow into someone who controls to keep it. A mind that once felt powerless may begin to seek power in subtle ways, not openly, not aggressively, but strategically. This is where the thinking starts to resemble something older, something studied. Centuries ago, Niccolo Machiavelli observed that power is most stable when it is not obvious, that influence works best when it feels natural, when people believe their choices are their own, even when they are being shaped. This idea does not live only in history. It appears quietly in human behavior. Because for someone who fears losing control, direct force is too risky. It creates resistance. But subtle influences, that creates compliance without awareness. So instead of demanding control, they guide perception. They shape the emotional environment. They shift what feels right and what feels wrong. And over time, this becomes their language. Not words, not actions, but influence. It doesn't always look intentional. Sometimes it isn't fully conscious. But the effect remains the same. A slow redirection of another person's reality. Not by taking control directly, but by making control unnecessary. Because when someone begins to adjust themselves without being asked, the work is already done. And this is where it deepens, not in what is done to you, but in what you begin to do to yourself.
It doesn't happen all at once. The mind doesn't break suddenly. It bends, slowly. And most of the time, it doesn't even feel like it's bending at all. It feels like thinking, like trying to understand. But something underneath is shifting. Because the human mind is not built to exist in constant confusion. It seeks stability, meaning, coherence. And when reality feels inconsistent, it begins to adjust itself to reduce the tension. This is where control becomes psychological, not through force, but through distortion. A moment happens. You feel something clearly, but then it's questioned. Are you sure that's what happened? That's not how it looked. You're remembering it wrong. And suddenly, certainty fades. Not completely, just enough. This is often called gaslighting, but it rarely feels dramatic. It feels subtle, almost reasonable, and that's why it works. Because the mind doesn't reject it, it tries to solve it. You replay the moment, and in doing so, you move further away from your original feeling. This is the mechanism. Not erasing reality, but replacing your trust in it. At the same time, something else is happening. Emotional dependency begins to form. Because when clarity becomes unstable, the mind looks outward for reassurance. And the same person who created the confusion becomes the one who resolves it. A cycle forms. Confusion, reassurance, relief. And relief is powerful. It creates attachment, not to the truth, but to the feeling of being grounded again. Over time, this pattern repeats, and each time, the mind learns something new, that clarity doesn't come from within anymore. It comes from them. This is where cognitive distortion deepens. You begin to reinterpret your own experiences, to filter your thoughts through their perspective, not because you're forced to, but because it feels safer, more stable, more certain. And slowly, something quiet happens. Your inner voice becomes less clear, less trusted, almost distant. And in its place, another voice becomes familiar. Not louder, just more believed. This is how control takes shape, not by changing your actions first, but by changing how you see. Because once perception shifts, everything else follows. Something inside you begins to split, not in a way that is obvious, but in a way that feels like constant tension. One part of you still senses something is wrong, a quiet voice that notices the patterns, the repeated confusion, the subtle discomfort. But another part starts to question that voice. What if it's just you? What if you're overthinking? What if they're right? And so a conflict begins, not with them, but within yourself. This is the part that feels the heaviest, because the mind is now holding two realities at once, one that feels true, and one that has been slowly suggested to you. And instead of choosing one, you begin to move between both, back and forth, clarity, then doubt, confidence, then guilt. It becomes exhausting. But leaving the cycle doesn't feel simple, because it's not just about understanding what's happening, it's about facing what that understanding means. If the pattern is real, then so is the realization that trust was misplaced, that perception was altered, that something important was slowly taken without being noticed. And the mind resists that, not because it wants control, but because it wants stability. So it holds on, to explain, to justify, to the version of reality that feels less painful to accept, even if it feels less true. This is why the control continues, not just from the outside, but from within. Because once the mind begins protecting the illusion, it becomes part of it. And breaking that cycle feels like losing something before it feels like gaining anything back.
It doesn't arrive loudly. There is no sudden clarity, no dramatic shift where everything makes sense at once. It begins quietly, a small pause in the usual pattern, a moment where something doesn't feel confusing, it feels clear, not explained, just seen, simply there. And in that moment, something changes, not in them, but in how they are seen. The words that once created doubt now feel patterned, predictable, almost rehearsed. The confusion that once felt personal now feels external, as if it was never fully yours to carry. This is the beginning of awareness, not loud, not empowering, just steady. You start noticing things you didn't notice before, the timing of certain comments, the repetition of certain phrases, the way clarity disappears and then returns only through them. And slowly, the illusion weakens, not because it is fought, but because it is understood. And understanding does something subtle. It removes the need to question yourself every time something feels off. The inner voice that once felt distant begins to return, not stronger, but more familiar. And with it comes a quiet realization that control was never just in what was said, but in what it made you believe about yourself. And once that is seen, the pattern can no longer feel invisible. It may still exist, but it is no longer hidden.
It doesn't happen all at once. Clarity doesn't return in a single moment. It comes back slowly, in fragments. A thought that feels like yours again. A feeling you no longer explain away. A reaction you don't immediately question. Small things, but they begin to connect. Because once awareness enters, the mind no longer accepts everything it once did. There is space now, between what is said and what is believed. And in that space, something begins to rebuild. Not confidence in others, but trust in yourself. It feels unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, because the mind has adapted to relying outward for so long. But slowly, that pattern weakens. You begin to notice your instincts without dismissing them. You feel discomfort without rushing to justify it. You observe without immediately adjusting yourself. There is no force in this process, no sudden strength, just a quiet return of awareness, of presence, of something that was always there, but slowly overshadowed. And with that return, control begins to lose its structure, not because it is challenged directly, but because it is no longer supported internally. The patterns still exist, the words may still be said, but they don't land the same way. They don't reshape reality the way they once did, because the mind is no longer handing over its authority so easily. And in that shift, something changes, not outside, but within. Where control once entered, there is now recognition. And that changes everything, quietly.
Freedom, in this form, is not loud. It feels quiet, like something that was once heavy is no longer being carried the same way. The patterns may still exist in the world, the behaviors may still appear in others, but something within you has changed. You see them now, not with fear, not with anger, but with understanding, a clarity that does not need to prove itself, because once something is fully seen, it no longer holds the same power. Machiavelli understood that the strongest form of control is the one that is never questioned, the one that feels natural, invisible. But what remains unspoken is what happens when it is seen, not resisted, not fought, simply recognized. Because control depends on unawareness, on the quiet acceptance of altered perception. And when that awareness returns, the structure begins to fade. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to create space, your own clarity, your own perception, your own mind, as it was before it was shaped. And in that quiet return, there is something that doesn't need to be named. Not victory, not escape, just freedom. The kind that doesn't need to be declared, because it is no longer being taken.